9 consecutive Himalayan winters, 0 cubs lost to predation. Hold that number because it does not belong in this species' biology. Snow leopards breed once every 2 years, not by preference but by physiological necessity. Raising cubs to independence takes 18 to 22 months. The energetic cost of that commitment consumes nearly every caloric reserve a female accumulates, which is why the reproductive cycle resets on a 2-year clock rather than an annual one. The global snow leopard population sits somewhere between 4,000 and 7,500 individuals, a range wide enough to swallow an entire city, and itself a measure of how difficult this species is to study. Distributed across 12 countries and approximately 2 million square kilometers of some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Within that population, reproductive output is not evenly distributed. Some females raise 1 litter in a lifetime, some raise none. The baseline biology does not predict 4 litters. It barely predicts 3. And yet, at 4,200 meters above sea level in Spiti Valley, on a February night when the temperature drops to -25 degrees before dawn, a 38-kilogram female designated SLF04 moves downslope through the dark toward prey she has already located, along routes her body has memorized across 9 winters, through a landscape that actively eliminates everything not specifically engineered for it. She is 7 years old. She has 2 cubs sleeping in a den carved into a rock overhang at 4,800 meters, positioned too high for the wolf packs occupying the valley below, too cold for the common leopard whose range extends up the southern-facing slopes, calibrated with the precision of millions of years of selection pressure for the one predator evolution designed specifically for this terrain. She has done all of this before. 4 times. And the way she does it, the specific behavioral architecture she has assembled on this ridge across 9 winters, is the reason the number on the ledger reads the way it reads. Dr. Kulbhushan Singh Suryavanshi, India Program Director of the Snow Leopard Trust and head of the Nature Conservation Foundation's High Altitude Program, had been constructing individual records of Spiti's snow leopard females through camera trap rosette identification and GPS collar data since the early 2010s. The research was not looking for outliers, it found one anyway. Across a decade of documentation, one female had produced reproductive and territorial outcomes so far beyond the population baseline that the research team found themselves looking outside the species for comparison. The closest parallel in the literature was a long-studied elephant matriarch from the Amboseli Basin, another female who had converted accumulated landscape intelligence into outcomes so distant from the population average that they initially appeared to be something other than biology. What they were, in both cases, was biology operating at the edge of what the design permits, in the hands of an individual who had paid, year after year, for every lesson the environment offered. What SLF04 was doing on that ridge in February was not fortune. It was not instinct in any simple sense. It was a system, built specifically for this mountain, this prey, these competitors, this cold. And to understand the system, you begin where evolution began, with the machine itself. Evolution does not design for elegance. Every structural feature embedded in an animal's anatomy is a solution to a specific selective pressure, paid for across generations, tested against extinction, refined until nothing superfluous remains, and everything present is doing precisely the work the environment demands. Ask what the Himalayan high-altitude environment actually requires of a large predator. At 4,000 meters above sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen is approximately 60% of what exists at sea level. A human being transported to 4,200 meters without acclimatization would find brisk walking genuinely difficult. Running would produce headache, nausea, the earliest symptoms of altitude sickness. Most large mammals attempting sustained exertion at this altitude are in continuous physiological emergency. The heart beating faster, muscles beginning to labor at effort levels they would absorb without strain at lower elevation. SLF04 hunts here. She runs across loose scree in darkness at -25 degrees while tracking prey she cannot fully see, and the altitude barely registers as a constraint. This is not coincidence, it is specific engineering, and the engineering compounds. Begin with the tail. On most felids, the tail is a counterbalance during high-speed turns on flat ground. On a snow leopard, the tail runs 80 to 99 centimeters long on a body whose head-to-tail base length might reach 115. It performs the counterbalance function across three-dimensional terrain, cliff ledges, loose rock slides, sudden elevation changes, where the physics of balance are orders of magnitude more complex than a flat ground sprint. It is also performing a second function no other large felid requires. At rest, she wraps it around her face and forepaws, recycling body heat that would otherwise radiate into air cold enough to damage exposed tissue. The tail is doing two jobs simultaneously. It was shaped for exactly this landscape, across millions of years of selection pressure, and the design wastes nothing. The paws are disproportionately wide relative to body weight, each one a broad, furred platform, distributing 38 kilograms across a surface area large enough to prevent post-holing through the frozen crust of high-altitude snowfields. Where a wolf labors and sinks in the same terrain, she skims. The energy expenditure is not equivalent. In a landscape where caloric reserves determine whether a hunt succeeds and cubs get fed, that metabolic margin compounds across every kilometer of every winter. The nasal cavity is enlarged beyond the standard felid template, a biological pre-warming chamber for air cold enough at -25 degrees to damage delicate lung tissue before oxygen can be extracted from it. The coat runs in two layers, coarse outer guard hairs over a dense, woolly undercoat, creating insulation that operates independently of external temperature. She is not enduring the cold. She is carrying her own climate with her, sealed against the outside air by a biological architecture that processes -25 degrees the way a wetsuit processes cold water, as a condition the external environment imposes and the internal design neutralizes. And the hyoid bone, fully ossified in snow leopards where the roaring cats retain cartilage, eliminates any possibility of a roar entirely. This seems like a deficit. It is not. What the ossified hyoid produces instead is a vocalization architecture suited to the acoustic properties of cliff terrain, a long, resonant yowl that travels along rock faces, bends around overhangs, and announces presence without revealing exact position. The mountain becomes an amplification system for a call engineered to use it. A roar locates its source. The snow leopard's yowl does not. In terrain where position is the primary tactical advantage, the difference between announcing yourself and locating yourself is the difference between a deterrent and a vulnerability. Below her on the night of the hunt, 43 barrel graze in dim moonlight, attention oriented downslope toward the valley. This is not accidental on her part. She has positioned herself upwind and above them, using the specific overhang at 4,100 meters where the prevailing wind drops and ambient sound deadens. A reading platform built into the rock, a position she has used across multiple winters because it works. What she understood about Barrel long before the research team confirmed it through observation data is this: their vigilance is directional. A herd watching downslope toward the wolf territory they have spent generations learning to fear is a herd that has turned its full sensory attention away from the one predator that attacks from above. She is above them. The wind is carrying her scent away from the herd and out over the ridge. She is invisible to them in every dimension they have evolved to detect. She waits with a patience that looks from the outside like stillness and is actually a metabolic calculation. Every minute of waiting costs calories. Every failed hunt costs more. Not just the energy expenditure of the pursuit, but the deficit carried forward into the next cycle and into two cubs waiting in the den at 4,800 meters who have not eaten since she left them 9 hours ago. She is not patient in any emotional sense, she is precise. She has also learned something about Baral behavior that the research team eventually confirmed through years of structured observation and which cannot be separated from the success rate of her hunts. Prey animals do not maintain uniform vigilance across the full geometry of a herd. Vigilance is socially distributed. The animals at the outer margins of the group scan outward. The animals in the center monitor the behavior of those around them rather than scanning independent arcs. And across the full population of a herd, the directional bias of attention reflects the directional history of threat. Baral have co-evolved with wolves, with common leopards, with the occasional presence of humans on the lower slopes. They have not co-evolved with an ambush predator that comes from directly above at speed. The gap in their threat model is vertical, and every hunt she has executed successfully from above has required nothing more sophisticated than finding the animal whose position makes the vertical approach viable and moving before the window closes. A ewe separates from the main cluster by 15 meters, angling toward a rocky outcrop above the herd where wind-exposed vegetation offers marginally better forage. The separation is small. The exposure window lasts approximately 40 seconds. She is already moving before the ewe reaches the outcrop. What follows is not the horizontal pursuit of an open-ground predator. She drops from the ledge, covers 12 meters of exposed slope in 4 bounds that use the terrain rather than fight it, and launches onto the ewe's back from above before the animal has processed the sound of something approaching. The strike is vertical, the snow leopard's signature, the conversion of elevation into force, the use of the mountain's own geography as the primary weapon. Forelegs lock around the neck, rear legs anchor against the hillside. The bite to the throat follows with the efficiency of an action performed enough times that efficiency has become the only mode available. The herd explodes downslope and reassembles within 20 minutes. Baral are not sentimental. The arithmetic continues without ceremony. But this is where her behavior diverges most sharply from the theoretical baseline, and where the machine reveals itself as something more than anatomy. A large felid with a fresh kill in an uncontested landscape feeds slowly, rests between bouts, returns to the carcass over 12 to 24 hours. That is energetically optimal when no competitor can reach the kill. Spiti Valley is not an uncontested landscape. The 2 wolf packs below have been documented displacing snow leopards from kills, the cat calculating defense against retreat and retreating. The wolves take everything the hunt produced. She does not operate on that schedule. She feeds fast and deliberately, taking the highest caloric portions first, organ meat, the fat-dense tissues, with a focus that any observer registers as urgency, because it is urgency. Because she understands precisely what arrives on this landscape within hours of a fresh kill. When she has fed sufficiently, she moves the remainder. 200 meters to a narrow crevice in the cliff face, a slot barely wide enough for the carcass, absolutely inaccessible to an animal whose shoulder breadth exceeds the opening. She caches it there, marks the entrance, and leaves. The wolves, when they arrive, and the camera trap data shows they do, stand at that crevice and do exactly nothing. She has turned the mountain's own geology into a food safe whose security depends entirely on the structural dimensions of the rock, which do not change based on how hungry the wolves are. Dr. Suryavansh's team documented this caching behavior across multiple kills and multiple winters, and found it consistent in a way that distinguished her from every other female in the Spiti study area. No other female showed it with the same geographical precision or the same consistency of site selection. SLF04 had, over 9 years, effectively memorized the cache-viable terrain features across her entire territory, a 3-dimensional map of every crevice and slot whose dimensions could protect a kill from a wolf, held not in any external record, but in the architecture of experience itself. That is what the machine is. But the machine's most significant test does not happen at the kill site. It happens 600 meters from the den, on the ascent back, when the wind shifts from the northeast and brings with it information that requires a different order of response entirely. In nature, intelligence is indistinguishable from patience to any observer who does not understand what is being calculated beneath the stillness. She stops on the ridgeline, and the stoppage is not hesitation. She stands completely still for 90 seconds, processing an inventory the wind has delivered without warning. Pica musk, barrel warmth regrouping below, the mineral cold of the high snowfield. And underneath all of it, threaded through the night's data like a signal through static, wolves. Not old scent, fresh, hours old, coming from above 4,100 meters. They are between her and the den. The problem is the geometry. The most direct route moves her northeast, directly into the scent plume, through a section of the approach where the ground opens, and her vertical advantage disappears into terrain where wolf-pack coordination becomes genuinely effective. The western route adds 2 kilometers across an exposed snowfield, visible from below for 400 meters, an elimination zone if any pack members are working the lower slopes. Waiting for dawn is not an option. Daylight brings the baral back upslope, shifting the wolves from exploratory mode into active pursuit mode, a fundamentally less predictable pressure on her territory. She has 2 3-month-old cubs in a den at 4,800 meters, mobile enough to scatter, not yet equipped with the muscle memory or bone density for sustained movement on exposed cliff terrain. At 3 months old, the den is the only safety they possess, and its safety depends entirely on the wolves not finding it. She turns east, and she climbs. The upper ridge system of her territory runs along a series of cliff bands stacked vertically, a single dark line from the valley floor below, a network of corridors and elevated platforms from inside. She climbs to approximately 4,600 meters to connected ledge platforms running parallel to the northeastern approach at 500 meters above it. From this position, she has the entire problem visible simultaneously: the upper plateau approach in both directions, the boulder field below the upper cliff band, the rock overhang marking the den entrance, dark, still, undisturbed. And the wolves, 5 of them, moving in the loose, ground-covering lope of animals, investigating rather than pursuing. A splinter group, most likely younger animals pushed upslope by competition from the established packs below for the baral descending ahead of the cold. They carry the specific watchfulness of predators operating outside their familiar range. They are hungry. They have followed the strongest scent concentration on this section of the mountain, her kill site, her territory, her cubs. She watches them for 4 minutes without moving, then she begins to mark. What follows over the next 40 minutes is not territorial advertisement in the abstract. A snow leopard's scent marking is a communication system of considerable specificity, and what SLF-04 produces on the approaches to the den is closer to a legal document than a signal. She moves along the cliff system above the approach routes in a circuit, systematic, deliberate, executed at a pace covering maximum area in minimum time. She hits every scrape post, every spray point, every cheek rub surface with fresh marking, working upwind so the signal arrives ahead of her physical position. For any animal navigating by scent toward the boulder field, the message intensifies with every meter of approach. This territory is occupied. The occupant is here right now. The occupant is currently active in this specific section of terrain. Solitary carnivores cannot match social predators through direct force. What they manufacture instead is uncertainty, a chemical presence extending beyond their physical location, compressing the invader's confidence in what they might encounter, buying time for the terrain to do work the individual animal cannot do alone. She is not counting on the marking to turn them. She is making the mountain speak before she appears in it. When the upper circuit is complete, she selects a ledge 30 meters above the approach the lead wolf is working, set back from the cliff face, shadowed by an overhang, visible from directly below and invisible from every other angle. She settles there with the particular stillness of an animal that has chosen this position deliberately and intends to hold it. She waits. The lead wolf, large, thick-coated against the altitude cold, carrying the watchfulness of a predator operating at the edge of its mapped territory, reaches the lower boulder field and reads the first fresh scrape post for nearly 30 seconds. His head comes up, his ears rotate forward. He is recalibrating, not retreating, but shifting the internal calculation of what is likely ahead. The pack's energy shifts from loose exploration to something more concentrated and less certain. SLFO4 steps to the forward edge of the ledge, backlit by the sky in full view of the approach. Long tail, wide shoulders, the absolute stillness of an animal that has chosen exactly this moment to be seen from a position prepared 4 minutes in advance. Then the sound, the long, resonant yowl produced deep in the chest, carried through the cliff corridor in a way that prevents any listener from precisely locating its source. The sound travels along the rock, bends around overhangs, arrives at the wolves' position from a direction that does not correspond to the visible silhouette above them. She is both a visual presence and an acoustic one, and the acoustic presence does not have a fixed address. The lead wolf looks up. The mountain goes quiet. What happens next lasts nearly 2 hours and is not dramatic in the way predator confrontations are usually dramatic. There is no charge, no clash, no resolution through violence. What happens is a negotiation conducted entirely in the language of terrain and presence, and it is the most precise expression of what 9 years of landscape knowledge produces under maximum pressure. The wolves test the approach 3 times. First test, the lead male moves upslope and finds a passage between 2 house-sized rocks, 2 body widths across at its widest, narrowing immediately to single file, eliminating any possibility of coordinated pack movement. A wolf pack's primary tactical advantage is coordination. Single file terrain eliminates it completely. He stops. He retreats to the fan formation. Second test, 20 minutes later, 2 younger animals try the western flank and reach a 4-meter vertical step that SLFO4 clears in a single bound, and a wolf cannot negotiate without stopping entirely. They assess it. They turn back. Third test, the lead male again, eastern approach, marginally wider, the closest thing this section of the ridge has to a viable approach for an animal of wolf dimensions. He gets 40 meters in before the route narrows and the ground tilts at angles that make fast movement unpredictable. And SLFO4 appears on a ledge above him, not 30 meters now, 10. Close enough for direct eye contact in the moonlight, close enough that the geometry has stopped being theoretical and become something immediate and physical. A resident who is higher, crouched, with a launching platform below her, and complete knowledge of every route out of this terrain that he does not have. She does not make the sound this time, she simply looks at him. He holds the position for 15 seconds, then he turns and walks back to the others. What the research team, reconstructing this sequence from GPS track and camera trap footage across the following days, found most significant was not the confrontation itself, but the consistency of her positioning choices throughout it. Every ledge she selected over the 2-hour negotiation gave her the same structural properties: height above the approach, shadow coverage against the skyline, and a retreat angle back into the cliff system that a wolf could not follow. She had not improvised these positions in the moment. She knew where they were. She had moved through this terrain in darkness across 9 winters, and the positions were already mapped, already evaluated, already held in her body knowledge as the locations that convert presence into advantage. The confrontation lasted 2 hours. The preparation for it had lasted 9 years. Predators are economists. The currency is energy and injury risk weighed against expected return. The Baral scent that drew this group to 4,100 meters has led them to terrain whose architecture increasingly favors the resident, on approaches that narrow and steepen with every attempt, against a female who has announced her presence, held every tested position, and demonstrated through the structure of the terrain itself that the cost of continuation is rising, while the probability of reaching anything useful is falling. The lead male turns northeast and leads the group back toward the lower contours where the terrain makes sense for the way they hunt, where their advantages reassert themselves, where hers diminish. She holds her ledge for 19 minutes after the last wolf passes below her, verifying, waiting. Then she moves, fast. She reaches the den in 40 minutes. The cubs are awake at the entrance, two dark shapes in the deeper darkness, eyes catching the moonlight with the reflective brightness of their early development, drawn there by a distant call she had made on the ridge. She greets them briefly, low chuffing, her tail sweeping across each small body, and then, without rest, moves them. Not in panic, with precision. One at a time, carrying each cub by the scruff through sections of the route too difficult for them to navigate independently, releasing them to walk the easier terrain themselves, her body a guardrail between them and the drop throughout. 300 meters along the cliff face, along a traverse using ledge connections the research team had not previously documented in their field maps of her territory, connections that existed in no record except the 9-year accumulation of her experience. At the end of the traverse, a secondary den, deeper overhang, narrower entrance, interior space just sufficient for a female and 2 cubs, and nothing else. She had used this site before. GPS clustering at these coordinates appeared in the records from a previous winter during an earlier litter. She had not found a good den and settled. She had built a network of viable sites across her territory and maintained active familiarity with every one, deploying them as each winter's conditions required. The practical consequence is that territorial pressure which would compromise a fixed den cannot compromise her. Redundancy is embedded in the architecture of her survival. She has options, and the options exist because she built them into the system years before she needed them. The cubs settled against her in the new den. The temperature outside dropped to -28. The wolves were gone, for tonight, and likely longer. The terrain calculus does not improve for them on repeated attempts. She wrapped her tail around the cubs and closed her eyes. 3 kilometers of cached barrel at 4,100 meters, 2 cubs breathing steadily against her ribs, a den the wolves did not know existed. For a predator operating at the absolute biological margin of what this landscape allows, that was everything. Records without mechanisms are curiosities. Mechanisms, properly understood, become the basis for the one thing a curiosity alone cannot generate: the knowledge of what, specifically, to protect. Consider the arithmetic of what SLF-04 has accomplished in full context. Snow leopards breed biennially because the energetic cost of raising cubs to independence leaves insufficient recovery time for annual reproduction. 4 litters in 9 years sits at the absolute upper boundary of what the species biology permits. It means she has spent the majority of her adult life pregnant, nursing, or actively rearing, conditions that increase caloric requirements substantially while restricting her hunting range and reducing her capacity to respond to territorial threats with the full tactical freedom of a solitary adult. She has maintained this across 9 consecutive winters against 2 overlapping wolf pack territories, with a resident male asserting the same ridge system without losing a single cub to predation. The baseline biology does not predict this. Something built on top of the baseline biology does. By April, the landscape begins to change in the specific way that high-altitude cold deserts change. Not warmth, not yet, but a shift in the quality of the snow. The iron crust of February and March develops a slight give in the afternoon hours. The Baral respond by spreading across the hillsides in looser formations as the winter's compressed survival logic starts to dissolve. In the 3rd week of April, the cubs come out of the den for the first time. The camera trap, repositioned above the secondary site, catches them at 6:14 in the morning, in the flat grey light before the sun clears the eastern peaks. The footage is what wildlife camera trap footage almost always is: grainy, partial, shot at an angle that wasn't quite right. It doesn't matter. 2 shapes emerge behind their mother into the full, uncontained scale of a world they have never seen. Extravagantly spotted, smaller than they will ever seem again. stepping into morning air with the concentrated energy of animals encountering something genuinely new. The male goes wide immediately, testing the ledge edge with the complete confidence of a creature that has not yet accumulated enough experience to have a properly calibrated sense of what down actually means at altitude. SLF-04 reaches out one paw and stops him without looking. The unhurried authority of a mother who has performed this exact intervention before and fully expects to perform it many more times. The female sits close to the den entrance and simply looks at the mountain. At the base camp in Kibber that evening, reviewing the footage, someone puts a mark in the field log next to the date. Not a scientific notation, just a mark. The kind that accumulates over 9 years into a record that starts to look like something more than data. The field log for SLF-04 runs to multiple volumes across that decade. It is not a dramatic document. GPS coordinates, camera trap timestamps, behavioral observations cross-referenced against prey counts, wolf pack movements, seasonal weather readings. Entries that build, line by line, into a picture of how one female has organized her existence on a specific section of the Spiti Ridge with a precision the population-level data cannot capture. The research published by Suryawanshi and colleagues in journals including PLOS One and Royal Society Open Science has built a multi-year picture of how snow leopard populations navigate prey availability, territorial pressure, and the overlapping claims of wolves, herders, and seasonal weather in the world's most demanding high-altitude landscape. What the individual records add is granularity, the difference between knowing what the population does on average and understanding what one animal does specifically that produces outcomes the average does not predict. 3 behavioral patterns emerge from the data with a consistency that has survived 9 winters of documentation. None is extraordinary in isolation. All 3 are extraordinary in combination. The first is elevated cache behavior. Other females in the Spiti study area cache kills, as all large felids do. It is a fundamental survival strategy in landscapes with food competition. The difference is location. Other females' cache sites cluster near kill locations where retrieval requires minimum additional energy. SLF-04 consistently invests the additional metabolic cost of moving cached prey upslope into crevices and rock slots that wolves physically cannot access. Their shoulder breadth too wide for the opening, their anatomy simply incompatible with the geometry of the storage site. The caloric cost of extra transport is real. It is offset by a dramatically reduced rate of cache loss, which translates directly into reliable food access for her cubs during the extended periods she is away hunting. Her cubs are not dependent on the precision of her return timing. The food is already there, stored where nothing else can reach it, because she made a series of investments, carrying kills uphill rather than resting beside them, that the short-term energy calculation does not favor, but the long-term outcome does. This is deferred caloric investment operating as survival infrastructure. The second is den site rotation. Her territory's field maps show 4 confirmed den sites at varying elevations across the upper cliff band, with GPS clustering at different sites in different winters, and sometimes at different sites within a single winter, in direct response to changing competitive pressure. The secondary den she relocated the cubs to on the night of the wolf incursion was not discovered in that moment of need. It was documented as an active site in a previous litter 2 years earlier. She had used it before. She had maintained the knowledge of its existence across the intervening time, carrying it forward into a winter where the need for it was not predictable, but the preparedness was. She has not found a good den and settled. She has built and maintained a network of viable sites, kept active familiarity with all of them, and deployed them as each winter's specific conditions require. The practical consequence is that territorial pressure, which would compromise a single fixed den, the most common vulnerability in a solitary predator's cub-rearing strategy, cannot compromise her. Redundancy is embedded in the system at the level of design. The third pattern is the most difficult to quantify, and over time, the most consequential. Her consistent preference for the highest available terrain, maintained with a persistence that exceeds what energetic efficiency alone would demand. She hunts lower, where the barrel descend in winter. She caches lower, where the kills happen. But she returns to elevation after every hunt, every cache run, every territorial circuit. Her GPS track, reviewed across multiple winters, shows a female perpetually moving back toward altitude, always reasserting the vertical separation between herself and the primary competitive pressure in her landscape. The wolves operate below 4,000 meters with the consistency of animals whose anatomy and pack tactics are calibrated for that elevation band. The resident male operates across a broader range. The snow leopard's structural advantages, speed and precision on cliff terrain, the capacity to exploit the vertical dimension that no other predator on this mountain can access, exist most completely above 4,400 meters. She lives there. She returns there constantly, even when the energetic cost of the return exceeds what immediate survival pressure demands. It looks like preference. Over 9 winters, it functions like policy. Vertical separation is not a byproduct of her behavior, it is the organizing principle beneath it. Taken individually, none of these behaviors is unique to her. Snow leopards cache kills. Snow leopards use multiple den sites. Snow leopards favor steep terrain. What distinguishes her is the degree, the precision, and the consistency, the way these behaviors compound across years into a system whose outputs exceed what any single behavior could produce alone. The elevated caches make the cubs food independent during her hunting absences. The den network makes territorial pressure non-lethal. The consistent elevation preference preserves the terrain advantage that makes both of the first two behaviors possible in the first place. Remove any element and the system weakens. Maintain all three with the consistency she has demonstrated across 9 winters, and the system produces what the ledger records. The full weight of that ledger requires its full context. The global snow leopard population of 4,000 to 7,500 individuals is not a population of equals. Within a species spread across 12 countries and 2 million square kilometers of high-altitude terrain, in one of the most understudied ecosystems on Earth, reproductive output is concentrated. The females who consistently raise multiple litters across a decade, who produce cubs that survive to independence and establish their own territories, who hold position against competitive pressure year after year. These animals contribute to the next generation at a rate entirely disproportionate to their individual weight in any population count. SLF04 weighs 38 kilograms. She is carrying a significance for the future of her species that has no relationship to those 38 kilograms. In May, her GPS track slows. More stops, longer pauses between positions. The research team recognizes the signature from previous litters. A female traveling with cubs not yet capable of adult pace, stopping at specific locations that recur across different years of data. She is teaching them the territory. The ledge crossings that hold in the dark, the hunting approaches that use the terrain's geometry against the prey's vigilance, the cache crevices at 4,100 meters, whose dimensions she has memorized down to the width of the opening. She is transferring 9 years of paid-for knowledge into 2 animals who have never been outside the den until 6 weeks ago, in the only language available for it. The body moving through terrain, stopping at the relevant features, lingering long enough for the pattern to register. This is the final mechanism. The knowledge she has built does not disappear with her. It transmits forward, imperfectly, incompletely, but in the form of cubs who have walked the territory beside their mother, who have been stopped at a ledge edge by a paw they did not see coming, who know the secondary den exists because they were carried there on a February night they were too young to fully understand and old enough to begin to remember. The territory knowledge accumulates in a lineage, not just an individual, and the lineage produces something the individual record alone cannot fully measure. Every cache crevice she shows them is a crevice they will not have to discover through failure. Every approach route she walks with them, stopping at the landmarks she knows, pausing at the positions that give maximum read of the landscape below, is a route they will carry into their own first winters as independent hunters. The transfer is not complete, it cannot be, but it is the difference between a cub that inherits a territory and a cub that inherits a territory already mapped, already tested, already loaded with 9 winters of solved problems. The advantage compounds, generation by generation, in the specific terrain that specific knowledge fits. The mountain does not change quickly. What she has learned about it will remain useful long after she is gone. Return to the ridge, February, -25 degrees before dawn. She is climbing back toward the den after the hunt, 3 kilometers of vertical gain in darkness, on a body that has just expended significant energy killing a baral and moving its remains into rock that a wolf cannot open. Her GPS collar transmits a steady, unhurried track up the ridgeline. Unhurried. As if altitude is not a variable, as if -25 degrees is simply the temperature at which she operates, which, for 9 winters running, it has been. What 9 years of field records reveal is not only the story of one exceptional female, it is a precise map of the distance between endurance and mastery, between an animal that survives a landscape and one that has learned to use it as a tool. The Spiti Ridge did not become easier for SLFO4 across 9 winters. The wolves still arrived. The baral still moved with the seasons. The cold still dropped past the threshold of what most living systems can absorb. What changed was the density of knowledge she carried about every feature of her territory. The cache architecture, the den network, the approach geometry at each elevation band, the specific contours that converted her disadvantages into advantages and the invaders' advantages into dead ends. The landscape remained constant, her relationship to it did not. And that difference, between a landscape endured and a landscape understood, is the entire distance between the average and the record. Raw power operates in a single dimension. A wolf pack has coordination and numbers. A resident male has mass and territorial range. SLF04 has 38 kilograms and a mountain she knows completely. What the records show, with the consistency of 9 winters behind them, is that terrain knowledge, deployed with sufficient precision and maintained with sufficient consistency, compounds across time into something that outlasts any individual advantage of size, strength, or social architecture. Raw power is a condition, adaptation is a system, and a system, once built and sufficiently refined, reshapes every contest that takes place inside it. The mountain keeps its own ledger. 9 winters, 4 litters, 0. That number does not belong in the average of this species' biology. It belongs to a female who paid for every lesson this landscape offered, hunt by hunt, cache run by cache run, wolf confrontation by wolf confrontation, and retained every payment. What looks like genius from the outside is probably just what it means to have paid that price long enough that the debt becomes the structure you live in. On the ridgeline at dawn, before the sun clears the eastern peaks, her silhouette appears for a moment against the brightening sky. Long tail, wide shoulders, the complete stillness of an animal reading a landscape it knows entirely. The light shifts. The shadow of the upper cliff moves across the ledge. She is gone. Not a ghost. A ghost leaves nothing behind. She is exactly where the mountain trained her to be, simply not visible to those who have not yet learned where to look. If this is the kind of wildlife storytelling you want more of, the science behind the record, the mechanisms beneath the behavior, the specific intelligence that makes survival look like routine, subscribe and stay. What comes next begins where this ends, at altitude, in the cold, in the specific darkness that only the extraordinary learn to navigate.